Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly complex, devastating conflict that engulfed the Middle East between 2024 and 2026, involving the US, Israel, and Iran. But we're going to do something very specific here. We are going to map this entire thing strictly through Tehran's own strategic worldview. So let's just dive right in. To really make sense of all the headlines, the military strikes, and those massive geopolitical shockwaves from the last few years, we've got to start with a really foundational question. How does the Iranian regime actually perceive its own actions in this war? By digging into the intelligence, historical data, and state communications, we can actually start to decode the strategic calculus of a nation that sees itself as fighting an absolute existential battle for survival.
Let's kick things off with part one, the ideological pivot, and how they went about redefining the region.
The roots of this modern conflict actually trace back to a massive historical shift. Now, in what might seem like a crazy historical twist today, before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran and Israel actually cooperated really closely. They had robust trade, Iran was supplying oil to Israel, and get this, they even ran joint military initiatives together, like the Project Flower missile development. But then, post-1979 happens, and Ayatollah Khomeini completely flips Tehran's foreign policy on its head. Israel gets redefined as the little Satan. And hey, this wasn't just tough talk. It was a total systemic realignment, cementing Iran's core identity and resisting what it views as Western imperialism and Zionism.
Which brings us to a pretty eye-opening number. By 2024, this whole ideological stance wasn't just some top-down government mandate anymore. It was basically hardwired into the national mindset. Public polling showed a whopping 64% of Iranians explicitly opposed any normalization of relations with Israel. That kind of domestic alignment is a huge deal. It gave the regime exactly the internal legitimacy they needed to keep up that fiercely anti-Western regional posture.
Moving right along to part two, let's talk about the axis of resistance and their use of asymmetric alliances.
So, because Iran honestly just lacked the conventional military muscle to go toe-to-toe with its highly advanced adversaries, it had to adapt. I'm sure you've heard the media use the word proxies all the time, right? Usually when talking about groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. But here's the thing. Tehran flat out rejects that word. They strictly define their network as the axis of resistance. From Iran's perspective, this isn't a proxy ring. It's a completely legitimate strategic alliance of oppressed peoples fighting foreign occupation. Basically, it acts like a giant defensive shield, keeping their enemies bogged down way beyond Iranian borders.
It is a total 180-degree flip of the Western narrative. The Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs literally throws the proxy label right back. They argue that it's actually Israel that operates as the destabilizing proxy for American interests in the Middle East. Honestly, grasping that specific reversal, that is the absolute key to understanding how Iran justifies all its regional operations and the massive funding it pumps into these groups.
Okay, so this whole dynamic is literally a textbook example of a classic geopolitical concept, the security dilemma. Think about it. Iran is funding and arming these regional groups because it feels this overwhelming need to defend itself against Western encirclement and Israeli intelligence operations. But on the flip side, Israel and the US look at those exact same actions and see them as incredibly offensive, aggressive, and destabilizing, which of course prompts them to strike back. Basically, what one side sees as a completely defensive move, the other side sees as a direct aggressive threat. It's a vicious cycle.
And that brings us to part three, crossing the threshold from shadow war to direct fire. For years and years, this security dilemma just kind of simmered in the shadows, right? Covert operations, cyber attacks, quiet skirmishes. But then, that tension finally boiled over into overt, state-to-state confrontation. We saw the threshold officially crossed, starting with those mutual strikes back in April 2024. Then things really surged with Iran's massive missile barrage in October 2024. It got even worse when the US bombed Iranian nuclear sites in June 2025. And, well, the whole thing just culminated in a totally devastating full-scale war by February 2026. Let's break these key moments down one by one. So let's look at October 2024. That is when Iran launched Operation True Promise 2, firing somewhere between 180 and 200 ballistic missiles, including their super advanced Fatah 1 systems straight at Israel. Now, the whole world was basically watching in shock, but Tehran, they were arguing this was a completely legal, justified act of self-defense. In their eyes, they absolutely had to do this to reestablish deterrence after the assassinations of key allied leaders, like Hamas and Hezbollah commanders.
Basically, Iran felt like its defensive shield was cracking, so they felt forced to put on a massive, direct show of strength. But that attempt at deterrence, yeah, it didn't hold. In June 2025, the U.S. launched direct strikes that significantly damaged Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Now, the U.S. framed this as a totally necessary step to deny Iran a nuclear weapon. But Tehran, they interpreted this as a massive, unprovoked violation of their sovereign territory. That was it. The shadow war was completely over, and the direct war was on.
And then we hit the absolute point of no return in February 2026. A massive, coordinated wave of 2,000 U.S. and Israeli strikes absolutely hammered military and leadership targets all across Iran. And these strikes killed incredibly high-ranking officials, including, most notably, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. When you combine that with explicit calls for regime change coming from both the U.S. and Israel, the Iranian government didn't just see this as an attack anymore. They perceived it as an all-out existential fight for the very survival of the Islamic Republic.
Which leads us to our fourth and final section, a war of attrition, Tehran's ultimate gamble.
Okay, so you're facing an adversary with just totally overwhelming conventional military superiority. What do? Well, Iran activated a strategy that wasn't actually designed to win a traditional military victory. It was designed to just endure. They had these very deliberate, calculated steps. Step 1, draw the conflict out indefinitely to exhaust the enemy. Step 2, make military intervention just prohibitively expensive. Step 3, target those Gulf states to really strain U.S. relations and fracture coalitions. And finally, Step 4, totally disrupt global energy markets to basically force the rest of the world to scream for an end to the fighting.
To actually pull this off, Tehran unleashed this intense campaign of economic and asymmetric warfare. They partially blocked the Strait of Hormuz, which, if you know anything about global oil, is a massive choke point. Then they launched strikes on critical infrastructure across 13 different countries, deliberately targeting energy facilities just to spike global inflation. It's a huge psychological calculation. Tehran basically bet the farm that their regime could absorb domestic pain and casualties for way longer than Western democracies could ever tolerate soaring gas prices and broken supply chains back home.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Even in the middle of this brutal, grinding war of attrition, Iran wasn't just blindly lashing out. They actually put forward a highly structured diplomatic off-ramp called the Islamabad Memorandum. This was a comprehensive 10-point framework that outlined their exact conditions for a permanent ceasefire. It totally proved that Tehran had a very specific, calculated endgame in mind, and they were just using their military leverage to force a deal on their terms. When you look at this proposed trade-off, it's pretty stark. On one hand, yeah, Iran was offering some major concessions. They'd suspend expanding their nuclear program, ensure safe transit in the Strait of Hormuz, and even enter direct talks on ballistic missiles. But, and it's a big but, this was only in exchange for the total lifting of sanctions, releasing their frozen assets, ending the U.S. naval blockade, and actually paying them war reparations. It was this incredibly bold gambit. They were demanding survival and massive economic relief, all without ever dismantling that regional network they'd spent decades building. Which honestly leaves us with a pretty profound final thought to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. Think about it. If Iran's entire strategic calculus is built around just outlasting its enemies, enduring immense pain and inflicting all this global economic chaos instead of actually winning on a conventional battlefield, then who really holds the power to end this kind of war? Is it the side with all the overwhelming military firepower, or the side that simply refuses to collapse? Thanks so much for joining us, and always keep questioning what you read in the headlines.